everybody, it's me, JJ Panzer, your Smart Apartment Advisor with the Real Management Company. One of the most common calls that I get is from people looking to rent their single-family homes, condos, or TICs in San Francisco, and it happens for a variety of different reasons. So today I want to talk a little bit about when that makes sense and when it doesn't. And as a tip, it's not usually the best idea. If you like our videos, please make sure to press the subscribe button down below so you get notified anytime we have new content. We'll be putting out new videos on a regular basis about a variety of different issues related to apartments and home rentals, so look forward to having you as a subscriber on our channel. So let's start and talk a little bit about the common reasons that I get when people call and they're interested in renting their home. This is essentially any situation where you live in the home now or you've lived in the home recently and you've moved out or you're thinking of moving out and you want to make sure you keep your home. The first thing to remember is that a lot of times people look at renting their home as a way of keeping it in the long term because they feel that as long as they have their foot in the door of San Francisco real estate, they're going to be able to come back to San Francisco. Now, depending on your resources, that may or may not be the case, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that works. But one of the first reasons that I get is I'm going to be traveling for work and I will be away for a year or 2 or 6 months, and I don't want to have to sell my home as a result of this temporary relocation. Another reason that I get is, gee, my mom or dad has lived in this home for 40 or 50 years. It's the family home. It has a lot of sentimental value, or mom is now living in a facility, and we want to keep the home as a long-term investment. Another reason is they want to have an investment property. They want to become a real estate investor, and they want to buy another home, live in that one, and rent the old house out. A lot of different things that go on with that, but we're going to talk a little bit today about when it makes sense to rent your home and under what circumstances you can actually expect to make money. Let's talk a little bit about the laws in San Francisco. I talk about this a lot. We'll talk about rent control versus eviction protection and when it applies to certain homes. The rent ordinance in San Francisco was put into effect in 1979, and it said every property currently in existence as of June 13th, 1979, I think is the date, is subject to this ordinance. And the reason why they had that carve out was so that all new properties would not be subject to it, because if you could imagine, why would anybody build new housing if it was going to be subject to these really restrictive laws that keep you from being able to make fair market value and being able to ask people to leave your home. So rent control applies to everything built before 1979. There's also eviction protection, which is a separate part, and amazingly, a lot of people don't realize that this is different from rent control, but eviction protection is the requirement that a landlord prove just cause, and everybody hears about this a lot, the 14 or 16 just causes for eviction, in order to ask a tenant to leave for no fault of the tenant's own purposes. So you've got rent control, which prevents you from being able to raise the rent on a unit beyond what the rent board allows you to raise it, which is capped at 60% of the consumer price index, which means over time your rents actually are decreasing in comparison to what you could get on fair market value, because the fair market typically goes up over the course of each year, or over the course of a longer period of time. You also have eviction protection, which is the requirement that you prove just cause in a property. A property built before 1979 is subject to both rent control and eviction protection. Now, any property built after 1979 is not subject to either one. There is also a specific carve-out. Single-family homes and condo units, any situation where there's a single unit owned by a single owner, and that's the only unit that they operate at that premises, that property is not subject to the rent ordinance. Single-family homes are not subject to the rent ordinance because of a state law called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Law, which went into effect in 1996, and says that single-family homes and condos cannot be grouped into rent control, and the price that a landlord charges can't be controlled. But those houses, if they're built before 1979, are subject to the eviction protection part of it. So a single family home, you can change the rent from year to year and keep the rent at market, but you're not allowed to simply ask a tenant to leave. Why would you want to ask a tenant to leave? Well, you don't like that tenant. That's one good reason. Or you want to move back into your home. You're not allowed to say, here's your 60-day notice, I want you to leave. Now, outside of San Francisco, outside of the rent ordinance, you can do that at any time. Give a tenant 60 days notice if they've lived in the property for a year or more. Give them 30 days notice if it's been less than a year. And you can legally insist that they give you your property back so you can do with it what you want. Now, let's talk a little bit about the difference for rental purposes between single-family homes, TICs, and condos. Single-family homes, pretty self-explanatory. People pretty much understand what single-family homes are. They are a single structure that houses a single family or a single tenant on one piece of land. They can be split up in lots of different ways. You can have townhomes where they share a wall in the middle. But for all intents and purposes, a single-family home is a single unit on a piece of land where only one tenancy or occupancy is allowed at a specific time. So you could also have a TIC. Now, a TIC is a common thing in San Francisco when it comes to multi-unit building ownership. And that's where, say, a 3-unit building, for example, is owned by 3 different owners, and they all occupy different units in the building. In this circumstance, the big difference between a single-family home and a TIC is that there are more than one owner, there are more than one family occupying the dwelling. But one similarity is that you have one piece of land. The city assessor recognizes a TIC as being one property, not 3 properties, and there is one tax bill for the entire property. Now, as TICs have become more common in San Francisco, the differences between TICs and single-family homes or condos have been reduced, but that tax bill and tax parcel difference is one of the most important single differences. You don't have separate tax bills. You can have, however, separate mortgages. It used to be the case when TICs were first introduced, if you had a 3-unit building, you had to get essentially a 3-unit building loan, and all 3 owners had to be on that loan together, and they all had to make contributions to pay that loan into one separate account. And if one owner failed to make the payments on their portion of that large mortgage, all 3 of them could lose their home. And as time has gone on, and there has been more competition and more opportunity, smaller, more boutique banks have gone into the TIC lending business to the point where now these banks actually make it possible for you to get your own fractional TIC loan so that you only have to pay your mortgage, your neighbors pay their own mortgages, and if one owner defaults on their loan, the bank agrees that they're going to step into that owner's shoes and not foreclose on the entire building, even though a regular bank, under a normal circumstance, could do that and use the other owner's portion of the property as collateral to help satisfy their debt. TICs, the loans typically have a more expensive interest rate. They tend to be 3/4 of a point to a point or more expensive than your standard single-family home or condo loan. And for all intents and purposes, a lot of the rest of it tends to be the same as a single-family home or a condo, except that you may have things like shared water bills, shared garbage bills. There's a need for a little bit of central management in bookkeeping, and somebody has to pay the central bills for the house in addition to paying their own individual bills. Condos are the sort of gold standard for multi-unit living in a lot of ways. If you can't afford a single-family home, which, a single-family home is more expensive than a condo, typically on a per square foot or a per door basis, but you could have a multi-unit dwelling situation where each owner essentially has their own tax parcel. They have their own separate right to occupy their individual unit, and those condo units are a much more readily accessible home, much more readily accessible investment. Many more banks are available to make condo loans than TIC loans. The same banks typically that would loan for a single family home would loan on a condo, and the rates are much more competitive. Condo ownership, especially in a large circumstance, can be much more difficult, I would say, in a lot of ways, because you have to deal with lots of neighbors who have authority and input into how a building is operated. But condos are a very specific and well recognized and understood sort of investment as compared to a TIC, where there are more of them than there used to be, but it's still a little bit of an exotic investment that is tailored to the San Francisco market. We have a lot of small to medium-sized apartment buildings that have been sold into multiple ownership. Now, how does the law affect what goes on for renting single-family homes, condos, and TICs? Well, single-family homes and pretty much every condo are not subject to rent control in terms of having the restriction of how much rent you can charge. So when you rent your single family home or your condo, you sign a lease, and let's say the rent is $5,000 a month. That's a $60,000 lease over the course of a year. And when that lease is up, if the owner feels that the rent that they could get on the open market is 5% higher, $5,250, 10% higher, $5,500, they can tell the tenant, here's your 60-day notice, I'm raising your rent, and I want you to either sign a new lease or don't sign a new lease, but the new rent's going to be $5,500. And if the tenant fails to pay the new rent at the landlord's choice of that higher amount, the tenant can be evicted from the home. Now, let's review. For rent control purposes, you're limited to 60% of the consumer price index, which is typically a couple of percent or perhaps even less, depending on what inflation has been doing. And so the rent increase amount is up to the landlord because rent control doesn't apply. Now, for single family homes and condos that are built before 1979, the landlord is not allowed to simply tell the tenant, I want you to leave. The landlord must prove just cause. The tenant is causing a nuisance, the tenant hasn't paid the rent, the tenant is laying waste to the property, the tenant is causing some problem that has violated the terms of the rental agreement, and as a result, the tenant needs to leave because it's their fault that they're being asked to leave. The landlord can't say, well, I'm moving back to San Francisco after being assigned to Singapore for work for the last 3 years, and now I want to live in my house. Well, that's not the tenant's fault. And in pre-1979 condos and single-family homes, it is not possible to simply ask the tenant to leave without just cause. If we talk about TICs, TICs are typically done and typically found most frequently in small multi-unit buildings that are built before 1979. And because they are not single individual units, they're not condos, they don't have separate tax parcels, a 3-unit TIC that is built before 1979 is subject to rent control and to eviction protection. So it is a standard rental apartment, and the owner of that rental apartment will not have the ability to raise the rent beyond the rent-controlled maximum allowable rent increase, or to ask the tenant to leave for any reason except that they want to, that they can prove just cause. So as you can see, there may be more opportunity for somebody with a single family home or a condo to at least be able to keep their rent at market for the foreseeable future and not be limited by rent protection, even if they're not going to be able to ask the tenant to leave without proving just cause. For TIC owners, I can't think of a single good reason why you would ever want to rent a TIC unit. And I'm going to get into a few of the other reasons why that could be problematic a little bit later on. So let's talk in general. When does it make sense to rent your single family home or condo? Really, the most important thing to keep in mind, and this is something that I talk about in my book, The Smart Apartment Investor, which you can get on Amazon, and I talk about with property owners, rental property prospective owners all the time, is if your cash flow is going to be positive, if there's going to be enough monthly cash flow to at least help you cover the cost if there's a major repair and you're not going to have to dig into your own pocket to pay for it, or if you feel like, gee, this is going to be worth the amount of time it's going to take and it's going to pay for all the fees that are going to be involved in renting this single family home or condo, then a lot of times I say go for it. That sounds great. You also have to be ready to make a long-term commitment. You have to be prepared to say this is going to be a 5-year or a 10-year business opportunity for you, not just a year, 2 years, 3 years while I'm relocating overseas. If you can make positive cash flow and you can see yourself making a long-term commitment to operating the property as a rental. You're not going to want to sell it at any time in the near future. You don't have any need for the capital that's tied up in that property on a short-term basis. You don't have an option where you think maybe I'm going to want to live in the house again. Those are all signs that maybe it would make a difference for you. I have to say, there aren't a lot of circumstances in my experience where renting an individual TIC ever makes any sense, because the concept of a TIC where you only have access to one unit but you are restricted by the laws as if you owned all 3 units or the multiple units in the building, it doesn't give you a chance to make up any ground, as the rents are flatlining over time based on the maximum allowable rent increase. So I tell people all the time, don't accept a cash flow negative investment for the purpose of saying, well, I want to stay in the housing market, or I want to stay online because I want to make more appreciation in the property. You're not here for the appreciation in the short term. You're here for the cash flow, and you have to make a sound business decision for the short to medium term in order to be able to access the long-term growth potential that you see in the property that you're really chasing in the long run. You have to be able to stick it out for the short run. Remember, if you are subject to the eviction protection restrictions in the ordinance, if your house is built before 1979, you are subject to the eviction protection portions of the rent law. You have to be prepared to either do an owner move-in eviction, which can be very expensive and difficult to successfully complete with a lot of restrictions, or to complete a buyout to get your vacancy of your unit. Let's talk a little bit about an owner move-in eviction. Let's say you own a condo that's built before 1979. It's subject to the just cause eviction rules, and you are going to be relocating for 5 years to someplace wonderful. You're going to be in, Sweden or Paris or wherever it's going to be. You want to keep your house in San Francisco. Here's what you need to expect. For the 5 years that you're going to be gone, you have no flexibility in terms of when you're going to come back to San Francisco, unless you have a natural vacancy, unless you rent your house and in a year or 2 years, the tenant just leaves voluntarily. That's your time. And if for some reason that timing doesn't work for you, it's been 2.5 years my place is occupied, and I actually found a way to come home in 3 years, you can't then somehow magically fill that extra 6 months. You're going to be stuck with 6 months of no income. Or, for example, another situation could be, my place has been rented for the last 2 years and I'm coming home in 6 months. My tenant is renewing, wants to stay for another year, and I'm going to be living in San Francisco, sleeping on a friend's couch for 6 months while I wait for my place to come vacant because the tenants told me they're really going to leave, but I'm not sure and I can't be certain that they're going to be leaving. So those are the kinds of situations you cannot force your way back into the house without doing an owner move-in eviction. Now, an owner move-in eviction requires that a landlord pay relocation expenses and give the tenant a 60-day notice to reoccupy their home. Now, relocation expenses in San Francisco as of this year amount to about $6,100 per occupant, with a maximum of 3 people who live in the home, which means that's about 18 grand right there in relocation expenses out the door. Now just imagine this is you're paying back from the rent that you've collected over all the time that you've been operating the property. You have to pay it back to the tenant so that they have relocation expenses. They can pay for mover, they can pay a new security deposit, they can pay for other costs, time off of work that are involved with the hassle of moving because you want to move back into your house. Now, an owner move-in eviction isn't a bad idea. It's perfectly legal. It's perfectly possible to complete if you are seriously thinking you're going to move back into your house and you've been out for long enough. If you're only gone for a year, that $18,000 is going to be something that you're going to look at and go, well, if my rent's only $4,000, I'm going to pay back, 4 months, a third of my rent that I collected over that entire time. to get back into my home, well, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Why would I want to do that? I might as well keep the house empty for a year, or let a friend live in it for, give them a 1/3 rent reduction and have them house sitting for you, and make sure that they are going to be out when you're ready to come back in. So if you're going to be gone 3 years, 5 years, there's probably enough money in the rent over that period of time to make that relocation fee worthwhile. Now, that relocation fee also has an extra bonus for the tenant. There's another $4,000 that's due if one of the people living in the home is elderly, disabled, or under the age of 18. Furthermore, if one of the people in the home is in any way connected to the San Francisco Unified School District, or if they have children who are of school age, you're not allowed to do your eviction until the summertime between June and September. So if you're ready to come back in December, you have to wait, serve your notice in April, and have it effective in June so that you can move back in the summertime. And that's up to you to fill all the gaps in all that equation. The other option, other than an owner move and eviction, when you want to move back into your home, if you don't want to go through the owner move and eviction steps, is a buyout. A buyout is a voluntary payment that the landlord makes to the tenant to entice the tenant to voluntarily move out of their home. So in this circumstance, we've already seen that an owner move and eviction is going to cost $20,000 to $25,000 on the outside plus legal fees. And so that tends to be the place where a buyout conversation begins with most tenants. Oh, okay, I'm going to pay you 20, 25 grand and give you more time than the 60 days that I would have to give you under an owner move and eviction. I would give you the $20,000 to $25,000, give you more time, and guarantee that I'm going to return your security deposit without any deductions. That would be another thing. But from there, it starts to go up. And you know that when you have a tenant who has been in the house for an extended period of time, that it's going to start costing more to get that voluntary buyout. So it could cost you $35,000, $40,000, $50,000. And according to rent board figures that I saw recently, the going rate for a buyout these days is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $50,000. In some circumstances, they can go for 6 figures. And it all depends on the circumstances of the buyout, the circumstances of the rent, how long the tenant has been there, and how far below market their rent is. A lot of times buyouts take place when we're dealing with rent-controlled tenants where the rent-controlled price is well below the market price, and it's worth the owner's money to pay a chunk of the appreciation, the increase in the value of the property, the increase in the cash flow that they'll get from renting the unit on the fair market to get the tenant to go so that they can get a vacancy and rent the unit. One of the other things that's really important to remember about owner move and evictions is there are other restrictions that go along with the rental of the unit. Yes, you pay the tenant relocation fees. Yes, you have to give them 60 days notice, but you also are then restricted from being able to rent your unit again on the open market for anything other than the previously controlled price if there was rent control, or for 3 years after you move back into the unit, you have to promise and guarantee that you are going to reside in the unit. It's going to be your principal place of residence. And if you're going to move out and rent it again, you have to offer it back to the tenant who moved out at the same price that they were paying before. Now, 3 years from now, or 2 years from now, say, that price could be below market, and you are required to reoffer that price to the existing tenant before you put the unit on the market at fair market value then. So as a single family home or condo owner in a building before 1979, you have to be very, very careful that you are sure if you're going to do an owner move and eviction, you're going to be able to live in the house for 3 years after you come back, that your job's not going to take you away, that you're not going to get wanderlust and want to be, pulling on a sled with a dog team in Alaska on the Iditarod for a big portion of the year. Whatever it's going to be, you have to make that house your primary place of residence for 3 years. There's also an additional restriction that was put into the ordinance, specifically focused on rent-controlled units, that says that for another 2 years after that 3-year period, you don't have to reoffer the unit to the original tenant at the original price, but for another 2 years beyond that, you are forbidden from renting the unit beyond that original price that you had when you kicked the tenant out for another 2 years. So essentially the restriction is you have to keep your unit off the market for 5 years and call it your principal place of residence during that time. So if that's something that you think might be difficult for you, that your job is putting you in a position where you're going to want to pursue those globe-trotting opportunities and you can't make the house your primary place of residence for 5 years after you come back, and you're not going to be gone for at least 3 to 5 years, I would say, you want to think really, really carefully about whether it's time for you to rent the house or you want to find some other solution, let a family member live there or sell it and buy something else later. Once again, my main message in this has to be, don't rent a pre-1979 TIC unit because you are subject to rent control and eviction protection areas of the rent law. You also have to deal with neighbor issues. I've seen a lot of situations where neighbors drive each other crazy in TICs. It happens in condos too, but in TICs, the owners of the building, the people who live there, are so closely intertwined with each other because they have that same tax parcel, they have the same tax bill to pay together every year, and they are really closely interwoven with one another. It becomes very difficult to deal with those issues, especially if you have a tenant in the building and you can't control your tenant, and your neighbors are getting upset with you and they're angry that you're renting the unit in the first place and you're not living there because that wasn't what they signed up for when they bought their unit. So you have to be really careful. I think in 99% of circumstances, any TIC unit that I would see as going vacant should be sold, not rented in San Francisco for the foreseeable future. Rent control, once again, makes that very difficult. And one of the other things that I've seen occasionally, but that is very difficult and problematic, is that rentals of a TIC can make the condo conversion process very difficult. Now, condo conversion is actually almost completely impossible in San Francisco now. A few years ago, there was a moratorium placed on all condo conversions. Essentially, the turning of a multi-unit building that's owned by several different owners into separate condos with separate tax parcels. Now, technically, there really is no difficulty from a assessor's office standpoint with splitting one lot into 3 different parcels and sending 3 different tax bills to 3 separate owners in that circumstance. But politically, there really is a difficulty in allowing those individual units to go from a multi-unit building into separate condo units and getting them out of rent control. One of the other reasons why I rarely recommend that TICs built before 1979 ever be rented is because doing so makes condo conversion very difficult. Now, condo conversion is actually something that we don't see anymore in San Francisco. A few years ago, there was a moratorium placed on all condo conversions. And condo conversions are simply saying that you go from a 3-unit building with 1 tax parcel and 1 owner and split that tax parcel into multiple owners and have multiple different units. Now, in the past, it's been problematic to see that multi-unit buildings get split into separate condos because those separate condos then are not subject to the rent ordinance, and they stop becoming rent-controlled housing as a result of being converted. So the moratorium was placed, but there was one specific carve-out in the moratorium against condo conversion where 2-unit owner-occupied dwellings, so a duplex, a house, carriage house in the back with a house in the front, any situation where you had 2 units only, not 3, not 5, just 2, and both units were owner-occupied for a period of 3 years as a TIC, those properties could automatically be converted to condos and then have a split done so that the 2 units have separate tax parcels and are treated as separate units. Now, in the circumstance where those duplexes or any building really has been converted into separate condos, the people who manage to convert from TIC to condos, the owners who convert from TIC to condos, are considered the condo developer. And the condo developer is not actually allowed to be exempted from rent control. The first person after a building has been converted from TIC to condo who is eligible to be exempted from rent control is the person who buys it from the condo developer. At that point, the condo is exempted from the price protections of the rent ordinance, and the owner of that condo unit is able to change the rent at any time after the lease is up to keep the rent at market. So let's review. You buy a downstairs unit in a 2-unit building with your best friend, and they live upstairs, you live downstairs. After 3 years, you condo convert. If you have to leave your home at any time and you want to rent it out, you are subject to rent control, regardless of whether you're a condo or a TIC, regardless of the fact that the unit's built before 1979. You would not be exempt from rent control until you sell your unit to somebody else. That person could then immediately turn around and rent the unit and be exempt from the price protections of the rent ordinance. Regardless, the entire building is still subject to the eviction protection parts of the rent ordinance that require that the owner prove just cause, but you're able to increase the rent at any time and go beyond whatever the maximum allowable rent increase is from year to year. Your condo unit that you've converted from a duplex, if it's built before 1979, once you sell it, as the condo developer, the person who turned it from a 2-unit building into a separate condo, once you sell it, the person who buys that unit from you is exempt from price protection under rent control. But they are still, no matter what, because the building is built before 1979, subject to the eviction protection just cause portion of the rent ordinance. Last topic here is the effect of renting. If you live in a TIC and you have finished out your 3 years, you're ready to condo convert, but you have rented your unit before that time is up, you are motivated to go through the condo conversion process because your condo is worth more than a TIC unit. Typically, we see the gap in price per square foot between TICs and condos is narrowing in San Francisco because the housing market is just so hot. People are willing to put up with some of the restrictions of TICs. As a bottom line, if you're going to have to pay 0.75% or 1% more for your mortgage on a TIC versus a condo, you're going to be willing to pay less to buy that same unit as a TIC versus a condo. But keep in mind, if you have a tenant in your TIC at the time that you are ready to condo convert, you win the condo lottery, which doesn't exist anymore, but essentially you find yourself in this difficult position, you are required to offer your tenant a lifetime lease. And that lifetime lease is a very, very restrictive thing if you choose not to buy out your tenant. At that point, the tenant knows that they have you over a barrel and they can ask for any amount of money, essentially, that would make it worthwhile for you to pay them to go away. So pursue a buyout in a circumstance where you have a situation like this. I always recommend that TIC owners sell their unit instead of renting them to avoid this as one of the many circumstances where that's problematic. In conclusion, single-family homes, condos, and TICs can be a complicated product to try to rent. For single-family homes and condos, they are exempt from the price restrictions of rent control if they are single-family homes and condos. If they're built before 1979, they are subject to the just cause eviction protection parts of the ordinance, meaning that the landlord cannot give a notice for no fault of the tenant and just ask the tenant to leave. TICs, almost never a good idea to rent. They are very restrictive. They are subject to rent control and to eviction protection. And if you have any questions about this, you want to get a feasibility analysis of whether the rent is going to be enough, the expenses are going to be too high, or your circumstance really dictates that renting your unit will make a good investment for you in the short, medium, and long run, give me a call, send me an email, look me up here on Facebook or on YouTube, and get in touch with me. I'll come out and do a consultation with you, and we can talk about your situation in greater detail. That's it for today, everybody. I'm JJ Panzer, your Smart Apartment Advisor with the Real Management Company. Talk to you later. If you're a property owner in San Francisco, I invite you to put the Smart Apartment Advisor to work for you. Give us a call at 415-821-3167 or send us an email, info@rmcsf.com. We'd be happy to chat with you anytime.